Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Network Visibility Controllers, Best Practices for Mainstreaming Monitoring Fabrics. My name is Raleigh Gould and I will be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is VP of Research at Enterprise Management Associates, Jim Frey. Jim has over 25 years of experience in the computing industry, developing, deploying, managing, and marketing software and hardware products, with the last 20 of those years spent in network management, straddling both enterprise and service provider sectors. At EMA, Jim is responsible for the network management practice area. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to our featured speaker, Jim Frey. Jim?
Thank you, Raleigh, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Let me start by saying a quick thanks to our sponsors of this research project that we're going to share with you today, ICSI and VSS Monitoring. Here's a quick view into the agenda for today. I'm going to first go through and describe what we mean by network visibility controllers, because it's possible that folks may not be familiar with this term. Then we're going to look at a little bit of the solutions landscape to give more context and firm up that definition. Then we're going to dive into the research and look at what we found in this project that just culminated recently. So, first of all, what do we mean by network visibility controllers, or NVCs? We're going to use the term NVC a lot today. And essentially what NVCs are is they are the core elements that provide the ability for gathering, harvesting streams of packets from a network, and then sharing those streams of packets to multiple network and security analysis and monitoring tools. This may be gathered using traditional approaches of span or tap. Historically, this type of access to the packet streams was accomplished on a tool-by-tool basis. Each tool is responsible for finding its own access via span or tap. But now we're running into cases where that's just not practical anymore for a whole number of reasons, and the NVC product area has evolved to meet that need. Sort of in between the old original approach and where we are today was an interim step where we saw products that would aggregate multiple streams together or matrix and share a stream, and those were called ag taps, aggregation taps, or matrix switches. But NVCs today, the class of products that I've been looking at and were the center of this research, are far more advanced than simply aggregation or matrixing. They provide a very flexible platform for connecting any number of packet stream sources to any number of consumers. Well, there's a limit to the number, but let's just say that it's far more flexible than it ever has been in terms of the way that you can align these. It can be one-to-one direct, and it can be one-to-many, many-to-one, or even many-to-many type connections. Beyond that, beyond simple connectivity, this class of products and solutions actually adds a lot of advanced functionality for modifying or manipulating or pre-processing these streams of packets so that you can improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the tools that you're attaching. This is the primary reason these features exist. We're going to look at those features in detail today. One of the other top-level functions that gets a lot of attention is the ability of these platforms to do load balancing across multiple instances of the same type of tool. And this is proved to be a very, very important aspect of this set of solutions. So you might have heard of other terms that actually describe the same thing. Now, I'm using network visibility controllers to mean products that have been described in all of these different ways over the past. And I myself actually use the term network monitoring switch in a lot of the writing and research I've done prior to this. But I found that was limiting in terms of what role it played, what role these solutions played. It's far more about visibility and having control over that visibility and not just being another switch. There is a switch architecture at the core of most of these products, but it's far more than just a monitoring switch. It really does allow you to take much more direct control and much more manipulative control over the streams. Gartner uses the term network packet broker. I think that grossly underserves the value that these products play, so I don't choose to use that term. And then there's some others here that get kicked around in terms of descriptions of these products. There's been many, and this is partly leading to some of the confusion in the marketplace of what is a network visibility controller, what's a network monitoring switch, what's a network packet broker, and what is not. So a little bit more, I want to talk about the solution provider landscape, and hopefully by looking at this, you'll have a better sense for what categories of tools and solution providers we're talking about. So in the research project that I just completed, I asked folks, which of these tools are you using? And here's a list, not in any sort of frequency order, just in pure alphabetical order, of the solution providers, the actual vendors that create and sell and deliver NVC solutions, and that had been put in place or were being evaluated or considered by the folks who participated in this research project. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are others out there, but this is the group that we ran across in our project here, our research project. There's some others beyond this traditional set of vendors. There are alternatives that we're going to talk about today. There are folks like Arista who are saying, hey, you can use traditional Ethernet switches to do this, provide the same sort of role. There are also soft switches or OpenFlow SDN type switch vendors like Big Switch who are offering some aspect of NVC-like functionality as well. We're going to talk in more detail about those going forward here. But I also want to mention just in general the fact that there's a lot of activity amongst the vendors in this sector. You'll see on that list on the left, everything in a parentheses is an acquisition. So there's been a lot of consolidation in the marketplace, but there are also a steady stream of new products coming out from these vendors. And there's even new entrants. We just had, just within the past 2 weeks, Network Instruments showed up and is now offering a solution in this sector called the Matrix. Not to be confused with a Matrix switch. It is actually a pretty fully functional NVC by my definition. So just an indication of how active this sector is. So the research. Now, what did we do with this research? The goal was to take a look at the way NVCs were currently being used, but then also take a look at where we see changes coming and what directions these are heading in the future, and really look at trying to draw from the experiences of folks who have deployed these to ask them, what were the real value points? What did you get out of this? And therefore, anyone who's looking at embracing this technology, how should we set expectations about what the best practices are, what the best values received have been? And so that's what a lot of what we were trying to do here is to get a grip on exactly what the state of these solutions are and what we should expect of them. So some demographics here. We had 177 participants. All of the people who completed the survey have either deployed, the majority have deployed NVCs, but I do have a group that participated that we drew in as well that are still in the planning stages but are in the late planning stages, planning to do something in the next 6 months. This turned out to be mostly North America in terms of the folks who participated, mostly organizations of 1,000 employees or more, and I think that speaks to the fact that the really little shops don't tend to need these products. They are for the large, more complex environments in general. But once we looked at above 1,000 employees, if we divide those up into small, medium, and large enterprises, a pretty even mix amongst the participants, which was really good. We had some really big shops, and we had some, not so big shops. Very good mix of participants from the roles perspective. Now, we define everything director and above to be executive, and by that definition, we had pretty much an even split of staff versus executive participation, and a good mix of verticals. And some interesting things came out of looking at things from a vertical by vertical perspective that you'll see as we go through this. So the first section that I want to set up here is around questions we asked and research we looked into around how these products are being deployed and what sort of environment they're being deployed in. So the first question here was, where do you put them? Where are you using NVCs in your managed environment? And on a sort of correlated basis, where is the monitoring happening? And clearly, the vast majority of folks are putting these products first and foremost to the core of their data centers, into the core network. But you can see a pretty good distribution of other places and other use cases, not nearly quite the sort of common, overwhelming answer of data center core, but they're being used in many different places, top of rack, end of row, data center edge, campus backbones, remote sites. Something interesting there around remote sites. You can see that in terms of most of the locations, there's, generally speaking, more planned to be deployed or new plans to deploy. But remote sites seem to be getting a little more attention versus history than some of the other cases. So a lot of use and a lot of still intentions to continue to deploy more looking ahead over the coming year. Next thing I wanted to look at, this is a big driver of the demand for NVCs in the first place, is what is the maximum speed, the network link speeds, in that top use case, data center core networks. And a pretty astounding answer here. I think I was really surprised by the number of folks who said, in this case, as you can see, that they're moving from 10 gig, 1 gig, 10 gig, 40 gig, a lot of them moving up to 40 and 100 gig. And a fourfold increase, on the number of folks who said they currently had 100 gig somewhere in their network, to the number who say that they're planning to deploy 100 gig within the next 12 months. That's a huge jump. And the reason it's so significant is virtually none of the monitoring or analysis tools out there today that operate on packets are qualified to operate at 100 gig. In fact, I'm not sure I know of any right now. There are quite a few that have made very recently the shift to say they can reasonably handle and process 40 gig. Most tools have made it up to the 10 gig level. But if we're looking at 12 months runway before we're seeing a lot of 100 gig, well, then we're going to need help from solutions like NVCs, which one of the things they do is they convert 100 gig links and either convert them down to a 40 gig or a 10 gig interface, and or even split them up so that you can parse them out and load balance them across multiple tools. Well, that's going to be very, very important here as 100 gig becomes more heavily adopted. By the way, one proviso, usually when we ask these kind of questions, there's a lot of wishful thinking here. And I think if we came back in a year, we wouldn't see 32% of organizations with 100 gig, but we would probably see a lot more than 8. So that's worth pointing out. Another interesting point that we wanted to test and find out about was the use of NVCs in an inline deployment mode. Now, this was really surprising. Again, a number of folks who said between either they've currently deployed an NVC inline versus and or are planning to do so versus not planning to do so. So you've got 90% of our respondents here saying they either are doing or planning to use their NVCs in this way. Now, inline to me means I think firewall as a good example, meaning that all traffic comes in one side of this box and it goes out the other side. The traditional historical deployment model for NVCs has been out of band, where you're grabbing a copy of packets from a tap or a span so that you can share that with the analysis and monitoring tools. Inline means that you are in path, which means it's a very different set of objectives. The primary use case that I have been told this is being used in is a security use case to allow load balancing across multiple security devices or network security devices. Not firewalls necessarily, but some of the other devices like IPSs. So that makes sense. It is a different sort of use case, and it brings with it some different demands on the architecture of the boxes themselves. So this is interesting. We want to keep an eye on this. I want to dive into this a little bit more, too, to make sure that the terminology I'm using is the same terminology that's understood by the folks out there. When I ask, are you deploying in line, I don't mean are you sequentially, serially in line between the packets and the monitoring tools, but are you truly in the path of the packets? If it's the latter, it's really quite a significant shift in the way these products are being deployed. So hopefully more to come on this. I think what's important to understand is this is becoming a very common approach and a common use case, at least in the concept of what inline means. A next area we looked at, because this is one of the big disruptors I've been focusing on for many years now, is the impact of virtualization. So we asked our participants whether or not virtualization was present. And when I talk about virtualized environments here, what I'm really after is the network aspects, virtual network infrastructure. And this takes really two primary forms. It's either virtual switches that exist, for instance, inside a hypervisor that connect the various different VMs together. Could be a distributed virtual switch. This is virtual network infrastructure. Also in this category are the concept of overlay networks, which are, again, typically virtual software-based and provide another layer of network infrastructure that isn't necessarily immediately visible. So the big question I had for folks, first of all, is are these types of technologies present? They are present. They overwhelmingly responded yes. I'm not showing that to you here, but that was a separate question. So the next question was, okay, well, what effect is that having? And here's some first step on that, response to that. And basically, the overwhelming answer is it is having an absolute impact on the way that monitoring is being approached for packet-based monitoring. Either it's changed the tools, the way the tools are deployed, or folks need it and they haven't done it yet, but they know they need it. 89%, looks like a little rounding error between these three bars. It should up to 100. But essentially, high 80% are seeing direct impact due to virtualization technology. So the next thing I asked, of those people who said yes, they have changed or they're planning it, what are you going to do about it? And here's the kind of things they shared back. And the answer here is, well, the most common answer, not surprisingly, is let's drop our analysis tools directly into the environment. Let's put them on a VM. It's pretty easy to then attach to the local virtual switch in promiscuous mode, listen to the packets going by, and from that interpret what's going on within a host. So this gives you intra-host visibility. Now this deployment model does not require an NVC, but it also tends to be somewhat limited in the scope of what you can see. So it's sort of a tactical answer to the problem, which is to try to cover in an exhaustive manner by dropping analysis tools here and there and everywhere on each of the hosts. It could also be a way to deploy a monitoring tool that you do use an NVC to pipe a packet stream to, and I've heard of a few cases of that, but in that case it's not intra-host visibility, it's just a different way to deploy your analysis tools. Span and port mirroring for virtual switches actually is a pretty well-established feature from most virtual switches now, and that gets plenty of use, and that could actually end up being piped then over through an NVC into monitoring tools. Virtual taps as well, slightly different theme or approach to this, which is instead of using a span or port mirror function from the switch, you actually install a VM or a kernel level library or function like the NetOptics Phantom BTAP, for instance, which actually inserts at the kernel level, draws off a copy of the packet stream and then shares them out a physical port. You still have to consume them out that physical port from the host, in which case you might want an NVC sitting there to collect that and then share it off to multiple tools. So that's still a case where you'd need NVCs. And the last one, and this is an emerging use case, and I mentioned earlier the use of overlay networks and encapsulations like VXLAN or NVGRE. In order to look inside that and see what traffic is going over there, you have to de-encapsulate. You have to strip away the encapsulations. And so there were some folks who are starting to do that, but that's still a minority use case. I would expect to see that grow over time as more overlay networks get deployed. Next question we asked was, okay, so what are you connecting? What's connected there? And we have lots of variety, lots of people using this for performance monitoring, basic security monitoring like DLP and IDS, IPS, troubleshooting tools. I think the takeaway from this is twofold. First of all, if we looked at the number of tools on average that people selected here, we've been tracking this one over a couple of years, and it's gone from 2 to 2.5, and now we're clearly over 3 tools on average per environment. So 3 tools that are all wanting to share the same streams of packets. And more interestingly than that, I think, is if you look at the planned in 12 months bars, again, there's nothing overwhelmingly common in terms of who is, everybody's deploying DLP or everybody's deploying application performance monitors, but it's a real mix. And if you add up the number of choices that people selected here, it's another 2 tools. So we're going from an average of maybe 3 to 4 tools up to an average of 5 to 6 tools over the next year. And this is exactly the reason why NVCs exist in the first place, is to handle the fact that you have more and more consumers who want to share access to that same stream of packets for analysis in different ways. Next, so from there, that's the environmental issues, sort of deployment situations. Let's take a look at some of the priorities that we found. And I broke this up into 3 groups. The first group here is the features that allow manipulation and modification of the packet stream. And it's pretty clear here. Now, I've got the results here split by looking at how the executive types answered versus how the staff types answered. And generally, they track pretty well with some minor exceptions, some interesting minor exceptions here. But generally speaking, load balancing is perceived to be delivering the most value out of these kind of platforms, followed by filtering, inbound and outbound filtering. Now, decryption's a pretty close fourth to outbound filtering's third if you look at the average here. And the next two follow pretty close behind that. Interesting difference in opinion around tunneling features. It looks like staff sees them to be more valuable than executives. Oh, by the way, let me stop and back up. The next three sections here, I'm using a 1 to 3 scoring range where people who would thought a particular feature was not important would give it a 1. If it's helpful but not necessarily critical, give it a 2. If it's critical, it's really a core function, give it a 3. So by that measure, you can see my scale here. All of these features are considered at least helpful, more than helpful, on the critical side of helpful. So none of them really dropped into these are really not important categories. They were all above a 2 on average. But only a few of them at the top end could we say the majority called critical, and this would be things like load balancing and inbound filtering that reached up to that sort of 2.5 level. So back to this list here, and the tunneling, the one divergence we see here between staff and executives. Now, tunneling is a feature that allows you to take a particular packet stream, repackage it, and send it off to another location to be consumed somewhere else for analysis. This is really something that's going to primarily be used in a fairly specialized remote monitoring or remote troubleshooting use case. And when you need it, it's extremely valuable to have this kind of capability. So I would attribute some of this disparity to be the fact that this is a little bit more of an esoteric sort of capability. The staff recognizes the need for it, and when they need it, they really need it. The other alternative is to try to do something like RSPAN or ER-SPAN off of a switch, which could do this but is problematic in other ways. It's much better to do it within the NVCs if that capability is there. But that's probably why staff understands the value of that and why they might need that. And so that's worth more to them than it might be to the executives. So I wanted to point out amongst these feature priorities, there were some variations by industry vertical. If we look at the financials tended, this was their top 4. They really liked filtering. They liked the load balancing, which we know everybody liked. And then outbound filtering was number 3, inbound number 1. They also called up timestamping. Now, this is commonly the case because the financials are very often supporting trading desks and trading floors, where latency is a really, really high concern, and the timing of transactions becomes very, very important to understand. And so timestamping turns into an important capability for that particular group. The next group that we looked at was healthcare pharma. Slightly different view of things. Again, top 2 sort of fit the overall top 2, but then they had a whole bunch of sort of tied for third features here, where they liked a bunch of the other capabilities, but it wasn't clear if any of them was necessarily greatly more important than the others. The manufacturing group, on the other hand, again, load balancing right up there at the top, outbound filtering number 2 in this case. But their number 3s were 2 features that were tied, dedupe and tunneling. So tunneling here, I think, is a great example of the fact that a lot of manufacturing organizations run with relatively thinner IT staffs, and yet they have globally distributed operations. And it's more common that they'll want to leverage remote troubleshooting scenarios and use cases where they need to be able to move packet streams across the network for analysis or special work. So I think that speaks to one of the reasons perhaps we see that pop up within manufacturing. And if I look at the all others, this is everyone but those 3 verticals, similar sort of list. We see decryption and tunneling again popping up a little bit higher than they might be on average. So some interesting things there, and definitely some variations depending on the type of business that become a bit more important. The second group of questions here are around the architecture of the solutions. And again here, this is split by executive and staff responses. There's some variations between them. But high availability and fault tolerance really clearly the most valued sort of architectural aspect of NVCs. That's providing the most value to the organizations. The next four are all, if you look at the total response average, the total mean by all responses, the next four actually end up kind of being tied. So the reason I'm showing them by executive and staff is at least we could see some variations, and I think it speaks out also to one important set of things here, which is that item down the list called direct and embedded performance monitoring. Relatively recent set of features that have been added to these class of products includes the ability to do some level of direct performance visibility out of the NVC, either hosted on device or through another set of software. Clearly, it's something that staff likes to be able to see at least some view. This is not going to displace your more complex and more feature-rich performance monitoring tools, but as an adjunct, it definitely appears to be relatively more important to the staff folks than it is to than some of these other features are. Two other things that we found in here, interestingly, onboard data storage. Onboard data storage was something that was most highly prized by the smaller organizations. And I would ascribe that to the likelihood that smaller organizations are looking for packing more functionality into their boxes that they buy, and therefore they're looking for an option to do onboard storage on these devices as opposed to having to supplement them with additional platforms that do onboard storage. And then also the triggered automated actions. You can see they sort of came in right in the pack, sort of tied for second with a lot of visibility amongst the executives in particular. The other thing we found was that the financial vertical really saw a lot more value in these automated actions, 10 points higher than the rest of the field. And so I think that speaks to also the fact that a lot of the financials have moved a bit further down the road in terms of their sophistication and integration, and the way that they try to make their tools adapt to and their processes adapt to the changing environment in as many automated ways as possible. They're a little bit further along than other verticals, perhaps, in that way. The last set of measures that we did were around administrative feature sets, and there's only three here. But there is some difference in the responses and the priorities and the values perceived here. So I've got the three: integration, multi-device management, and then graphical drag-and-drop configuration. So as have all of these have shown, everything's always considered helpful. We didn't find anything was really truly useless. So that's a good thing, I suppose. But certainly multi-device management and integration look like they're adding more value. In fact, they are both in total aggregate on the edge of being considered critical on average, versus the graphical drag-and-drop configuration considered helpful but not as critical. And then some interesting variations here between some of the verticals, in particular the financials. And I'd mentioned this just prior, do tend to look for more ways to tie NVC as well as other systems together. And the healthcare seemed to really like the multi-device management from single console and gave that very, very high marks. I'm not sure why that is versus the others, but it was remarkable in its strength of response. Okay, before we wrap up here, I've got a few minutes I want to spend on some alternatives. We're just about out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time here. Two key alternative types to the traditional NVCs. One is the use of general-purpose Ethernet switches. I mentioned Arista as an example of this. They're not the only ones who have either intentionally or unintentionally played this role in the past. I've run across a lot of shops and doing case studies around NVCs where folks have been using old end-of-life cat switches for this purpose. They eventually replace them with NVCs because they need something that's actually not end-of-life, that they can get support on and that has some more advanced capabilities than you could get. Similarly, the new architectures being offered by Arista still don't do everything that a fully functional NVC could do, but clearly they're getting some attention. And so I have two questions I asked around general purpose or general Ethernet switch products. First of all, is it a valid alternative, or is it complementary, or is it not relevant? You can see here that about a third said valid alternative, larger chunk, almost half said it's complementary. Some other folks said, really don't know yet. I took a look at the top two there, the valid and complementary answers, and asked, well, then what are you going to do about it? And found actually pretty strong support and intention to to actually deploy Ethernet switches as to serve some of these purposes. So within that subset, in this case, it's 137 of the 177. You've got 60 or 59% who are saying we've either deployed it or we're planning, and then another 34 that are evaluating. So quite a bit of attention being paid to how to possibly use these traditional Ethernet switches for at least some NVC purposes. Similarly, on the Softswitch side, the SDN OpenFlow Softswitch products, and again, the example here is Big Switch, and for instance, their Big Tap product. A little bit less strength of responses here, a little bit lower, because this is still earlier days for these kind of products. In fact, a lot of people at the bottom there didn't really know enough to make a firm decision on whether or not they're relevant today. But even amongst those, the ones who said yes, an alternative, or it is a complementary type of role, plenty of plans to look at and utilize this technology. And so I think that's worth keeping an eye on and watching how both the capabilities as well as the viability of these approaches evolve. All right, so let me give you a few takeaways here before we move on to question and answers. First of all, I think you've seen, and certainly we've seen from this research, that there is a lot of different use cases for NVCs, a lot of places they're being put, and a lot of intention to continue deploying more and more of these. So a lot of activity for sure. Around the use cases the features that are getting the most value, clearly I think load balancing and inbound outbound filtering, are sort of the predominant choices. Now, by the way, there's a lot of diversity within any of these feature sets, and we didn't get into the details about which inbound filtering features are more important than other inbound filtering features, and outbound as well. There's a lot more detail to go into we just couldn't get into in this particular research project. But broadly speaking, that filtering capability is very important, but it is second fiddle to load balancing. And as I mentioned, within certain verticals and within certain types of organizations, you will probably have some special feature needs that you need to pay attention to as you look at the various different options out there and decide whether, for instance, if you're in a financial and you really want timestamping, there are slight variations in the way the different vendors approach timestamping. It's worth becoming educated on that. High availability and triggered actions definitely showing strength from this architectural perspective, but also, the other features like onboard storage and basic performance monitoring features getting a lot of attention as well. And lastly, around these alternatives, there's quite a few folks who are looking at these alternatives. We have to keep an eye on them to see how they evolve. But I think the overwhelming consideration right now in both of these categories is they're more complementary than competitive. There are some places where they could serve this purpose, but in most cases, they're going to provide an alternative means to access and enhance a monitoring fabric, not necessarily become the core of the monitoring fabric itself. But we'll watch that, and we'll see how that changes over time. Okay, thanks. So with that, I want to take one more chance to thank our sponsors, ICSI and VSS Monitoring, and I will turn it back to Raleigh for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jim. We are a few minutes past our 30-minute mark, but I would like to ask at least one question. Jim, this question is, why are there so many different category names for these products?
It's a good question. I've asked that myself. No, basically, there hasn't been a concerted effort to try to really characterize this sector of solutions. They grew organically out of an expanded need from the access layer devices that were taps and ag taps and matrix switches. And a lot of the names that are out there were introduced by individual vendors who were trying to describe their own products and differentiate them. So consequently, there's a lot of names being kicked around. I think there's been some convergence, I will say frankly, around network packet broker because Gartner has advocated that term. As I said earlier, though, I just cannot make myself comfortable with that term because I think it greatly undersells the role and value that these solutions play, and that's why I've chosen network visibility controllers as a way to name the sector. Great,
thank you, Jim. I am going to conclude since we are past our 30-minute mark, but I did want to thank our audience for joining us today. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the playback URL. Also, you will receive another email when the full research report is available. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.